Welcome to this IISS webinar, the Abraham Accords, Evolving Partnerships, Persistent Challenges. For those who don't know me, my name is Tom Beckett. I'm the Executive Director of IISS Middle East, and our office is based in Manama in Bahrain, the Kingdom of Bahrain. We've all done webinars, countless webinars now, but just as a reminder, if you want to ask a question, you will see that you press the Q&A button at the bottom, type in your question, and then as we go into the question and answer session, we'll choose your question and try and group them together. Ask away at any time. We'll then gather them up, but please do ask questions. What I'm not going to do is to field them to people to speak, because that can be quite disruptive, and it often means that the sound and vision takes a bit of time to get through. And just in terms of this particular webinar, as we all know, the Abraham Accords were signed in Washington. Can't remember if the Rose Garden had been newly decorated by then, but anyway, in the Rose Garden at the White House on the 15th of September, we as an institute deliberately decided to slightly delay when we had this webinar so that we could reflect on what others said about 1 year after the signing of the Accords, and what that did mean for those evolving partnerships and also the persistent challenges. We've got a great panel in front of us. You saw their names on the first slide, but I'll just quickly go around them so that you know who's talking to you. We've got Ambassador Nancy Jamal, who is the Chief of Strategic Affairs in Bahrain's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and was previously working in London on the Counter-Daesh Communications Task Force. And so that was part of her pedigree there. Dr. Yoel Guzhansky, Senior Research Fellow at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies, but also the non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington. Sadly, as of yesterday, Marwan al-Balushi from the United Arab Emirates had to drop out, which is why I'm chairing and Hassan al-Hassan isn't, but it did allow me to relieve Hassan of that double task and allow Dr. Hassan al-Hassan, who's the Research Fellow for Middle East Policy here at the IISS, to take his role on the panel. I've asked all three of them to speak for no more than about 5 or 6 minutes on the topic at hand, and then we'll open it up for questions. And the speaking order will be Ambassador Jamal, and then Yoel, and then Hassan. And so with no further ado into this important subject, which I know I hope you will find interesting, and I hope that you'll have many questions to put to the panelists. But Ambassador Jamal, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom and the IISS for having us here. This is definitely a very important period for everybody that took part in the signing of the Abraham Accords. Let me start with, we have, based on our values here in Bahrain, we have His Majesty the King that has a vision of peace. He started it off he implemented it or tried to integrate it into governance here in Bahrain, but also we are trying to expand this vision to the rest of the Middle East. We live in a region that has been in turmoil for decades. We've been through many different wars. We have the majority of the population in this part of the world are youth. They're very young. They lack hope. They've seen nothing but war and conflict. And this issue has always been at the heart of many of the conflicts in the region. None of the other attempts to solve it actually reached anything. And I think it was time for something new to be attempted. And because of this, I think that with His Majesty's integration of peace, we decided here in Bahrain to sign the Abraham Accords and start friendly relations with the State of Israel. And accordingly, on 15th September 2020, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Dr. Abdulatif bin Rashid al-Zayani, was in Washington, D.C., where he signed the accords together with the US President Trump, Israel Foreign Minister, and the UAE. Many visits took place since then. It's been a year, but so many delegations from security backgrounds, from commercial backgrounds, from civil aviation, from businesses, from health, from agriculture, from security have been going back and forth. And with these negotiations that have been taking place, I think 25 MOUs or agreements have been signed so far between both countries, and 8 are currently in the pipeline. And this is part of how we perceive the relationship to be. It needs a structure, and we were working on the process of structuring it. I think in May, the head of the National Intelligence Agency, Yossi Cohen, when he came to Bahrain, and we put out a statement of his visit. Now, this was something very relevant to the relationship, because usually security agencies don't necessarily put out public statements, but the fact that we did showed the level of commitment that we were putting into this relationship. And I personally think that Bahrain has been very courageous in the decisions it's been taking so far in many aspects. We have accomplished a lot, I think, but everything, in order for it to be a sustainable relationship, we've been working on the infrastructure for it. I'm sure people that have been following it have been following with all the agreements that have been going through with different counterparts. I was in Israel, I think two months ago. We managed to, we had a meeting with the foreign minister, Yair Lapid, and we were also had the privilege of meeting President Herzog in his office. And I think the discussions that took place were very promising. Our ambassador, His Excellency Khalid Jalahma, moved to Tel Aviv about a month ago to set up an embassy, and we have diplomats there. And I think this is the beginning of a very positive, prosperous relationship with a regional country. I think I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for that sort of explanation of Bahrain's decision-making and His Majesty's decision to enter into diplomatic relations with Israel, but also your point about the MOUs that have been signed and those that are still to come, and working on a structure that will allow it to have a firm foundation. So that's been a useful introduction for Bahrain's motivation and rationale. Yoel, if I can hand over to you now. You're on mute, Yoel.
Can you hear me now? I want to strengthen my colleague words. I do think that King Hamad's decision was courageous and brave, especially because of the internal and external conditions that are unique in Bahrain. And I congratulate Ambassador Jamal and, of course, King Hamad. I want to give you my perspective on the year that passed on normalization and what are the obstacles that we might face. Well, the short time that has passed provide only limited perspective on the process of normalization. But even that limited perspective, I can say that the Abraham Accords present at least a diplomatic achievement for Israel, if not more. But at the same time, the potential for improving Israel's strategic position in the region has not been fully realized. The shared regional threat from Iran was and remain a primary motive for normalization. However, this drive has lost some momentum under the Biden administration. Indeed, the whole process has lost some momentum since Biden took office. It seems that the current administration is far less willing to provide security, economic, political dividends to the countries that signed or the countries that will sign the Abraham Accords, who joined the Abraham Accords. Still, I think creating, I call it an arc of cooperation between countries aiming to curbing Iran influence in the region, this still remains a very important goal for Israel and for the region. Among the normalization quartet, as I call them, relations between Israel and the UAE is progressing more rapidly than the others and bearing fruits, although mainly economic fruits. I want to talk about 4 challenges to normalization. The 4th one is the US policy, and this is the main one. Trump administration was the driving force behind the Abraham Accords. The interests of the 4 countries, the permanent interest was the relations with the US and the rewards that they received from the Trump administration. However, the Biden administration only rhetorically endorsed the normalization process and even froze some activity of the Abraham Fund, which was funded to promote economic cooperation between Israel, the Arab partners, and the US. The other issue that, of course, is a challenge and not a new one is the Palestinian issue. And in May, initial significant test came with the escalation between Israel and Hamas. They started in Jerusalem and moved to Gaza. Despite severe criticism of Israel from the 4 countries, none of the 4 suspended the agreements or the understanding being reached. None spoke against normalization. It was very interesting to see. And I think we passed this test in success. The 3rd issue that I want to touch about briefly is Iran. Iran has an interest of driving a wedge between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and perhaps Saudi Arabia as well. From Iran's perspective, this official and also unofficial relation existed before the Abraham Accords and after the Abraham Accords were all aimed to form what Iran sees as an anti-Iran coalition in the region. And I think Iran, after the Abraham Accords, fears a stepped up intelligence and operational Israeli presence in the Gulf. The 4th challenge that I want to talk about now, we don't have a lot of time, is people to people. I think like Israel peace agreement with Egypt and Jordan, the Abraham Accords, I'm sorry to say, are more reflections of Israel connections, enduring connections with ruling elites in Arab countries. With public in many Arab countries, mostly still hostile to Israel. This picture is slightly different in the Gulf, where a considerable portion of citizens, around 40%, last time that I checked, support normalization agreement, even after the escalation with Hamas. And this is very interesting. I think the Abraham Accords can also be viewed as a trial balloon for other Arab Muslim countries sitting on the fence, and I'm speaking mainly on Saudi Arabia and other perhaps Muslim countries, not Arab. If those countries conclude that drawing closer to Israel will help them strengthen their relations with the US, and they can gain economic and political, maybe security dividends, they are likely to cross this Rubicon and perhaps warmer ties with Israel. I think Israel has an interest in leveraging in the existing relations for the purpose of extending the circle of peace. I think the UAE and Bahrain also have an interest in expanding the circle of peace with Israel, if not to gain Arab and Muslim legitimacy for their choosing in normalization. I think Israel should do more to strengthen normalization. Israel should highlight the benefits of peace, enforcing highly visible joint civilian project, for example, with some of the countries. But to conclude, I'll be a bit pessimistic here, if I may. This alone won't help. I think it's not sufficient because the key element that facilitated the Abraham Accords was the US, was benefits from the last administration, which are essential for deepening and expanding the agreements. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoel. That's really helpful, and it's actually quite useful to put down those 4 markers of where the challenges might be. And we'll come back to it, I'm sure, in questions. But one thing that I'd probably suggest at this stage, that of course one of the rationales for the Trump administration to enter into or to persuade countries to take part in the Abraham Accords was to find an alternative to the deal of the century that was never going to happen. And so whilst the UAE and Bahrain's motivations were early and different, Sudan and Morocco were slightly otherwise, but we can come back to that. But your point about Palestine undoubtedly, and we already have a question about that, is one that will matter. But I'll now turn over to Hassan. Hassan.
Thank you very much, Tom. And what I would like to do is address many of the same geopolitical issues that Yoel spoke to, albeit a bit more squarely from the perspective of the Arab signatories of the Abraham Accords, and more specifically the UAE and Bahrain. And so the question that I'm interested in answering is, what was the original strategic rationale of the Abraham Accords for the UAE and Bahrain, and does it remain valid 1 year later? Does it remain valid today? I think the strategic rationale behind the signing of the Abraham Accords for the UAE and Bahrain could be summarized perhaps in 3 key points. Obviously, the relationship with the US. So the Trump administration, most definitely, led by Jared Kushner, I think was willing to reverse decades-old American policy to make the Abraham Accords happen. And so we saw the shift of the US embassy to Jerusalem, and we saw Jerusalem being recognized as Israel's capital. We saw the US recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, recognized Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, removed Sudan off the list of state sponsors of terror, and approved the sale of F-35 fighter aircrafts to the UAE. So Trump was I think, definitely a key engine and a key driver. And I think perhaps notwithstanding the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, the Abraham Accords, I think, was certainly one of the top foreign policy priorities for the Trump administration in the region. And I think from the perspective of the Arab signatories, the Abraham Accords were obviously a way of scoring points with the US and more specifically with the Trump administration. So the partnership with the US, I think, was a key driving force. The second one, I would say, was the converging threat perception with Israel on regional adversaries. So primarily Iran and to a lesser extent, Turkey. I think Iran, depending on how you see it, deserves credit or blame for being probably the most important catalyst of the Abraham Accords. So to a large extent, I think Iran's escalation in the Gulf in 2019, in the form of the Khrez attacks that affected Saudi Arabia's national oil production, the mining of merchant vessels off the coast of Fujairah. I think these created a palpable sense of concern, to put it mildly, in Gulf capitals, that something needed to be done in order to counter the Iranian threat. And I think Israel views Iran, I think, in certain respects, very similarly. There are joint concerns, and the potential for defense and security cooperation with Israel, be it through weapons procurement, especially in the areas of missile defense, but also in less kinetic areas such as cyber, joint technology development, potential for greater intelligence sharing. All of these help from the Gulf perspective, I think, mitigate the risk and threat from Iran. There is the Turkey factor as well. And I think obviously the UAE has had its share, and Saudi Arabia, its share of problem or concern with Turkey because of Turkey's advocacy for the Muslim Brotherhood. But Israel, I think, is equally concerned with Turkey's abrasiveness of the Eastern Mediterranean. And so Israel has joined the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, along with Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, and others. The UAE has had a clear interest in inserting itself into the Eastern Mediterranean theater as well, primarily through its defense cooperation, growing defense cooperation with Greece. So I think Iran and Turkey and a converging threat perception there has been a key catalyst of the Abraham Accords. And I think finally on the Palestinian issue as well, the UAE and Bahrain are both interested in being players in the diplomatic arena. I think the UAE, by establishing overt diplomatic channels with Israel, I think was potentially interested in playing a greater mediatory role, which is something that I think is a primary component of Emirati foreign policy. And I think the UAE celebrated as a victory its ability to convince Israel to impose a freeze on its settlement activity in view of what this could do for the UAE's credibility as a key regional player. The question is, does this original strategic rationale still hold today? So I think on the US side of the equation, yes, the Biden administration has endorsed the Abraham Accords. We've recently seen a virtual interaction where Foreign Secretary Blinken said very nice things about this, but it's clearly not as invested as the Trump administration was in widening the circle of the Abraham Accords Club or in enticing others to be on board. And so it's not doing much to entice potential entrants like Oman or Azerbaijan or others to join, and it's certainly not going to reverse or invest as much resource as the Trump administration did. I think on Iran, Israel, I think 1 year later, from the Gulf perspective, is both a potential strategic asset, but also potentially a strategic liability. So we've seen, obviously, we spoke about the potential for increased intelligence cooperation, defense cooperation. But on the other side of things, I think the flip side of this is that an escalation between Israel and Iran could ultimately present a risk of entanglement for the UAE and Bahrain. So as things escalate between Israel and Iran, especially if Iran continues to step away from its JCPOA commitments, then does the UAE and Bahrain's partnership with Iran, does that endanger them and make it more likely that they'll end up in Iran's crosshairs because of that association? So there is a chance that Israel constitutes a strategic liability because of the risk of entanglement. And obviously, I think neither Iran nor Bahrain want to be dragged into a kinetic or even non-kinetic confrontation with Iran. On Turkey, I think the rationale is becoming a bit less present and a bit less relevant because Turkey is currently de-escalating many of its rivalries and activities across the region. So we've seen a tactical de-escalation in Turkey's relations with Egypt, with the UAE, and with Saudi Arabia. And so the partnership with Israel on that front becomes, I think, less pressing. Finally, a few words on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, obviously, Sheikh Jarrah and the conflict with Israel's conflict with Hamas was a tough test for these relations. Clearly, the incident inflamed Arab public opinion, and I think showed, I think, as you all rightly pointed out, that that the Abraham Accords will continue to face domestic public opinion constraints in the Gulf, but also in the wider Arab world. I think something else that is often overlooked is that Saudi Arabia has significantly hardened its position on the question of normalization over the past year. So Saudi Arabia was spoken of as a potential Abraham Accord signatory, but depending on how one views Prince Turki Faisal's comments and how one takes them to be reflective of Saudi top-level thinking on the issue, Saudi Arabia, I think, has resorted to holding more closely, I think, or aligning itself more closely with the Arab Peace Initiative and with the two-state solution, and I think has hardened its position on the prospect of normalization. I think finally, the UAE and Bahrain have to balance their relationship with Israel against the role that they want to continue to play in the Palestinian arena. So the UAE is a firm backer of Hamid Dahlan, who is an adversary and critic of the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. And I think if the UAE, and it needs to retain a certain degree of credibility to be able to play an effective role in Palestinian politics, I think they would find themselves in a position where they would have to balance their relationship with Israel against their desire to be a credible actor in the Palestinian arena as well. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all three of the panelists, and we've got a number of questions lined up, and I'll probably leave the one about, which will be I suspect a recurring one, about Palestine and what has this done for the Palestinian cause till slightly later, because I'm just going to throw one thing out to Yoel and see whether it has any relevance. But in the light of the Hamas Israeli confrontation that occurred in May, what it would seem became more evident was the strength of Arab feeling about Israel's position, both with Israeli Arabs, but also in the West Bank and in the Gaza. And what we've done here is we've spoken very much from an Arab perspective. What I'd like to know is what's the Israeli perspective also about having relations with Arab countries when dealing with the Palestinian issue, and what is the solution for that? Noting what Hassan said about the meeting that was that Secretary of State Blinken was at, where the two-state solution was mentioned by all of the participants, all of the Arab participants in that meeting. But I think the first one, which I think is quite an interesting question from Ramin Foghani, is what can Europe do to assist with the Accords? I mean, as a second part of his question, he's asked if we'd see more European diplomatic missions in Jerusalem in the near future. And I suspect most of you will say that that's unlikely, because most of Europe seems to think that that would be contrary to the two-state solution that they are all about or strongly believe in. But Ambassador Jamal, if I could just ask you, from a diplomatic perspective, sitting in the Kingdom of Bahrain, how do you think that the Europeans can help with the Abraham Accords and the potential for peace that could come out of them?
Thank you, Tom. Well, first of all, I need to really stress that the way we perceive it is this is a country-to-country bilateral relationship. It seems that everybody wants to discuss it as a trilateral or as a multilateral, or bring in all the different elements and issues into this relationship. Whereas we just see it a way in which we can sustain peace, stability, and prosperity for our people, and hopefully for the wider region. I think the Europeans are very interested in the relationship, and we do often get on bilateral visits, do get questioned as to how the relationship is developing, and we do get offers into how they can be more supportive of it. I think right now, any relationship is built on first building trust, then setting the structure for it, and after that, I guess you just get on with things. The Europeans, I think, do have a role to play in terms of ensuring that the commerce side of things is taken care of. I mean, we have issues in commerce and banking and setting up these structures. A lot of these structures pass through these regions in Europe, in the US. It's very important to set the stage for all of that, to help us make it easier instead of just questioning how sustainable the relationship is. I think that's a very important thing, to support us in building the trust between different counterparts within our societies. At the end of the day, yes, it's a government-to-government relationship, but then it moves into the people. The people have to start building their relationships together. And I think we have different entities that are trying to work on that, such as the American, I think it's the American Chamber of Commerce, their Bahrain and UAE branch, they're doing a lot of work on this, trying to get the people from grassroots level to sort of engage with their counterparts. I think the Europeans could also create similar engagements and create platforms for discussion, for engagement, for building trust. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Yoel, would you have a view on what more that European nations could do? And perhaps then quickly after that, Hassan, if you've any thoughts on it, before we then go back a bit to what more the current American administration could do.
I wanted to talk about the Palestinian issue. I don't think, sadly, saying that I think Europe excluded itself from the peace process, sadly so, in last decade or more than that. But I want to briefly touch about the last round, the last conflict between Israel and Hamas and its effect on normalization, if I may. Or Tom, is it because you asked about it?
I did indeed. Okay, well, let me just then summarize some of the questions if we're going to deal with the Palestine issue now. I was giving a bit of breathing space on that, but I will do. So one of the questions was what is being undertaken by the Arab states, and we'll ask Ambassador Jamal and then Hassan to promote Palestinian statehood, and then yes, it's if you'd like to take your piece, Yoel. So it's really, so we've got two parts: yours that you're going to answer now, Yoel, and then from Ambassador Jamal and Hassan, what is being undertaken by Bahrain and the Emirates to promote the Palestinian cause, Palestinian state.
So if you ask about the Israeli perspective, I can give you my own perspective. I'm not in government anymore. If one looks on the last round between Israel and Hamas, one needs to separate what happened in Jerusalem and then what happened in Gaza. The reactions were different whatsoever. The sensitivity for Jerusalem in the Arab world and the Muslim world was, of course, shown with the criticism of all Arab countries, and the four normalization quartet countries joined the Arab, and everybody spoke in one line. Once Hamas started firing rockets on Jerusalem and the focus went to Gaza, then it allowed all of the Arab countries, and indeed the four normalization countries, to preserve a low profile in this conflict. I can tell you that in talks that I had with some of my Arab colleagues, I won't tell you who and where and from, some were actually disappointed that Israel didn't bend Hamas even more, didn't strike Hamas even more. It's not a secret that Hamas, a Muslim Brotherhood movement, a terror organization, as some of the Arab countries define it, is not very popular, not in Abu Dhabi, not in Riyadh, not in Manama, not in Cairo. So it changed when it moved to Gaza. I think this escalation and maybe the one that will come in the future, I hope not, but one needs to be realistic. The relations between Israel and the normalization countries put some leverage on Israel, those relations, and maybe it has actually a good effect, and it might shorten a future escalation between those countries. Normalization countries can go between Israel and Hamas, and can also pressure Israel to shorten the rounds between it and Hamas. What would happen if, and this was a very short conflict, I think 10 days, something like that. What would have happened? Let's ask ourselves, what would have happened to the normalization agreements if it was a longer one? Then I'm afraid that it would pose a challenge to the agreements, and we might see further damage in the future.
I agree. But before we go on to Ambassador Jamal and Hassan al-Hassan, I mean, it's a good point to separate out, the strength of feeling about what was happening in Jerusalem from then the rocket campaign that emanated from Gaza. I think that's a good point to make. I think your point about leverage, the quartets or the nations that have established diplomatic relations, their ability to talk to Israel about the issue. I also think we're maybe underplaying the Biden administration's desire for an end to that campaign, because they also didn't want to see the Abraham Accords being weakened. And then lastly, I thought what was interesting was, and on the back burner for many countries, Israel and the United States, came Egypt to the fore with its intermediary role to get that ceasefire to occur and to occur so effectively. So I think what it did was demonstrate the value of an old relationship, which is very much a securitized one, to a new relationship which is only emerging. But it did underline the importance that I think that Washington still places on limiting conflict in the region. But it would be interesting to get recognizing that in this part of the world, there are people here who don't talk about normalization. They talk about simply the establishment of diplomatic relations. And through the establishment of diplomatic relations, be interested to hear, Ambassador Jamal, what you may say about the Emirates and Bahrain's ability to promote Palestinian statehood.
Well, I'm not here to talk about what the Emirates, I don't represent.
Of course, absolutely, sorry.
Bahrain. And as I said before, this is a bilateral relationship between us and the State of Israel. With regards to the escalation of violence that happened in May, Bahrain welcomed the ceasefire that was reached between the State of Israel and the Palestinian factions in the Gaza Strip. In this regard, we commended the success of the efforts of Egypt in leading negotiations between the two parties and the effective international efforts to reach a long-term truce in preparation for entering political negotiations to restore security and stability and to deliver humanitarian aid and relief supplies to the residents of the Gaza Strip. Bahrain supports the Arab initiative that is very similar to the two-state solution. Our aim is for both parties to be able to reach to a position where they can actually sit together and enter into negotiations. I think the Palestinians have to want it for themselves. We share a very good relationship with the Palestinian authorities. I think a few years ago when Bahrain organized the Peace to Prosperity Forum, we did invite the Palestinians to participate. Peace and prosperity wasn't just for Bahrain or for our inner region, it was for the entire region. We continue to support that. We continue to encourage all factions to ensure that the Palestinian people have the right to a peaceful living. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And to you, Hassan.
Thanks, Tom. I did want to go back, to the distinction that you brought up in what happened in Jerusalem and the strong feeling on Sheikh Jarrah and the firing of missiles from Gaza. To be quite frank, I don't think most Arab audiences would agree with that distinction and would probably view the one as being the flip side of the other. But I think going back to the question on what the Arab states are doing and what the signatories of the Abraham Accords, are or could be doing to further promote Palestinian statehood, I think it's fair to say that we're going through a period of, and this is not directly related to the Abraham Accords, but I think this is a wider symptom of the state of the region. We're going through a period of Arab diplomatic paralysis. It's really, the points of consensus on which most Arab states used to agree on, for example, within the framework of the Arab League, are now extremely difficult to identify. So there isn't an Arab diplomacy as there once was. I think, so the Arab Peace Initiative, for example, which had long been the expression of the Arab consensus on how to approach the Palestinian cause of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is almost 20 years old and is premised on the two-state solution, which is all but dead in reality. I think the proponents of the Abraham Accord have argued that perhaps it's time to try another approach, an approach that is rooted and based on engagement rather than non-engagement, and the notion that the presence of diplomatic relations is more likely to allow you to get things done than the absence of diplomatic relations. The issue, I think, is that it is very difficult to see really what the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan put together could do to change Israel's national security calculus when it comes to its settlement and annexation or occupation policy. I doubt that they would be able to have a real impact on what Israel considers to be a core security issue for itself. I think there are far bigger players that haven't been able to change Israel's calculus on that front. And so it's a very difficult task to ask the Abraham Accord signatories to be able to do any, really, to bring about any meaningful change in Israel's calculus in that regard. And I think the arguments that were put forward as to the relative merits of engagement through the Abraham Accords become less and less valid with every passing day. Right? So at some point, the question is really how can practically would the signatories of the Abraham Accords be able to demonstrate a practical benefit for the question of Palestinian statehood from the Abraham Accords? And it's not entirely clear to me that that's a very easy thing to do.
Okay, well, what I think I'll do is, because this slightly takes the question away from Palestine, but one of the questions that we've had is, aside from economic prosperity, how could, and they describe the four signatory countries of that circle of peace, be extended beyond those countries and Israel for strategic benefit? So I suppose my question for Ambassador Jamal, but also for Hassan, is how do the four countries that signed that have signed an agreement, how do they get that to permeate, and will they try to get it to be more widely accepted in the region? And what's Israel's role in that? Recognizing, Yoel, that you said that you were pessimistic that with the Biden administration, that there would be much more proselytizing for this particular effort. So I wouldn't mind hearing, I'll go in reverse order. We'll get Hassan first, and then Ambassador Jamal, and then Yoel from the Israel end.
I think in terms of demonstrating to the region the wider benefits of the Abraham Accords and to try to create broader regional acceptability, I think Ambassador Jamal might be onto something here, in the sense that the signatories would have to bank on the bilateral aspect of this and perhaps minimize the broader implications, be they on the strategic or geopolitical front with Iran or Turkey on the one hand, or on the question of Palestinian statehood on the other end. I think I think this has been generally the approach followed by the UAE and Bahrain, which is to highlight the economic benefits, the benefits from tourism. And I think that there are plans, and perhaps Ambassador Jamal can tell us more about these, to cooperate further in the area of health, for example, or agriculture, and show that there can be direct economic benefits and social benefits from these relationships. I think this is probably the most realistic avenue for the signatories to be able to show. But on the question of Palestinian statehood, for example, that will really depend on broader factors that have to do with Israel's calculus, that will have to do with how much the US is willing to invest in broadening the circle of the Abraham Accords club, by trying to move forward on the Palestinian question, or by making the Abraham Accord a priority issue in its engagement with the Middle East, or in the way it deals with Iran. But that seems unlikely to be the case because the Biden administration's priority at this point is to revive the JCPOA in one form or another. And that, I think, is something that neither the UAE, nor Israel, nor Bahrain are likely to perceive as being conducive to their respective national security interests, especially if that proceeds with no parallel progress on countering Iran's network of armed non-state partners or missiles program.
Thank you, Hassan. I suppose part of that question is when unified statements as they were from the Arab League didn't really have much effect, whether the bilateral relations of the original 2 plus the new 4 plus another 10 adding to the voice of Europeans and Americans might be more persuasive in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And so, Ambassador Jamal, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, I think we remain very solidly behind supporting the Arab Initiative with the Palestinians, and we look at it from a different light and separately from our bilateral relationship with the State of Israel. I think the Israelis are clear on our position, the Palestinian authorities are clear on our position, and so we prefer to look at, I think, let's say, the gains of this relationship. It so happens that we share a common threat with the Israelis, and that is, yes, it's Iran and its malign activity in the region, be it its supporting of its proxies, its non-state actors that are firing into our next door neighbor, 53 kilometers away from us. Does it concern us? Yes, it concerns us. Are the Israelis concerned? Yes, they are. There's a lot of potential for security collaboration at strategic level with the Israelis. A lot of negotiations are taking place. We are meeting our counterparts. And I think we have reached, I think, to a very good level of agreement on potential lines of cooperation in this regard.
Joe.
Thank you, Tom. 3 short or not so short comments on security. What has changed? I mean, Israel had relations with those countries. I'm going to the Gulf for many years with my Israeli passport for many, many years. Security cooperation, according to foreign reports, not Israeli reports, is going up. You know, one can go back to the 70s and the 80s and the 90s in relations with some of the countries, and not all, but some of the countries in the Gulf. Actually, if you go out of the closet, security cooperation can be harmed. Some things better to do quietly. This is one on security. One asked about Corona. What did the Corona did to normalization? It did 2 things, 2 different things. In the beginning, I think it accelerated the relations between Israel and the UAE because both countries helped each other to cope with the pandemic. But later on, I think it slowed the pace of normalization between Israel and some of the Arab countries because it was harder to fly in and out of countries. So it did those 2 things. The third comment, what is the, we all, in the last hour, we talked about what is the strategic importance and change that the Abraham Accords brought. And this is a question that I'm thinking about the last year. And just looking at the glass half full, strategic achievements are not just security, especially if we talk about an isolated country in a region that is mostly hostile to it, and this is Israel. I think if the countries wants to show and to improve the relations and to get other countries to join, they have to show the success of the agreements. I think Bahrain and the UAE is doing exactly that. They showed how the relations with Israel and how Israel, technology, agriculture, you name it, can actually help UAE and Bahrain, and they show it to their people. And this is, I think, a step forward. I think one that we achieved already is not little, it's quite a lot. And everything has got to do in life in expectation. I don't know what expectation you put in the beginning. My expectation were very low, and I think most of them fulfilled. Even if you compare Israeli relations with UAE and Bahrain to Israeli relations with Jordan and Egypt, one can argue that the relations with the UAE now, publicly, people to people, are much warmer than Israeli relations with Egypt and with Jordan. If you look at the textbooks in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they've been changing the textbook that were sometimes anti-Israel before, and it's different now. So I'm very optimistic about this process.
Thank you, Joel. And I think actually one of the questions which people may want to touch on, it's those rather more, some people might think they're more peripheral, but it is that people-to-people person you're putting across, Joel, in that one of the questions is to what extent Bahrain can attract Arab Israelis to invest and attend universities inside the kingdom, and whether that's a reinforcing mechanism. And of course, then whether it opens up either the Hajj or Umrah to those citizens of Israel. So there's those side things. But there is also a question broadening it out, and with 6 minutes left to go, and we may run over slightly if people are willing to stay on. We'll see if they disappear off. But we haven't really done too much on Iran here. But I think the way that we'll go into that is there's a question from Sanket Joshi, which Hassan, I might turn to you, which is how do you see Iran becoming a full member of the China-led SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and how that might affect the Middle East? Hassan.
I think Middle Eastern players are generally concerned, especially in the Gulf, about closer Chinese-Iranian relations. And I think there was a lot of concern, for example, with the signing of the 25-year agreement between China and Iran, even though many of the economic targets, for example, or the investment targets that were somehow leaked or discussed surrounding that agreement were completely unrealistic. But the symbolic significance of that agreement, I think, has been a point of concern. The Chinese have also put forward a vision for regional security that is ultimately regionally driven, which is something that is almost entirely at odds with the approach of the GCC, of the Arab Gulf states, to regional security in the Gulf, which is, of course, to internationalize Gulf regional security by hosting a combined maritime forces, by hosting American bases, French, British forces, also Japanese and others as part of the CMF. And so I think there is in the Arab Gulf capitals, I think there is a distrust of what China's strategic intentions in the Gulf are. I think the SCO, the question of SCO membership of Iran, which is something that Iran has been after for quite some time, especially in the wake of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the larger role that Iran could potentially play on the Afghan scene, on the one hand through the working relations that it has built with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and on the other hand through the Afghan Shiite population, the Hazaras, which also have long-standing ties to Iran. And so the prospect of closer Iranian-Chinese relations, the prospect of Iran playing a bigger role in Afghanistan, I think these are things that are viewed in the Gulf with a great degree of concern. Now, that doesn't mean that China is likely to entirely pivot to Iran as far as regional security in the Middle East is concerned. I think China, for the most part, would like to stay out of the rivalrous dynamics between Iran and the GCC states or Israel. China ultimately has vested economic interests with all of these states. So China is a big investor in Israel in the agricultural sector specifically. That's one of the main, Israel is one of the main regional recipients of China's foreign direct investments into the Middle East. It imports a lot of energy and oil and gas from the Arab Gulf states. And of course, the UAE is a comprehensive strategic partner of China. And in fact, China has signed strategic partnership agreements with all countries of the GCC, with the exception of Bahrain. And so I don't think China is going to completely pivot on regional security questions, partly because it's to Iran, partly because it wants to stay out of this. But nevertheless, I think closer Iranian-Chinese relations are still likely to be viewed with a great degree of concern in Arab and other non-Arab capitals of the region.
Thank you. And Yoel or Ambassador Jamal, if there's anything that you'd like to say on that, on the SCO and China, Iran becoming a full member, please feel free. Otherwise, we've got a couple more questions that are going back over the original theme. But Yoel, I just might like to get a view from you and try and, if you can, Ambassador, I'm just looking at you, whether the SCO, whether there's anything you want to say on that.
You asking about China?
China, Iran, China, and what it means.
China is higher and higher on the regional agenda every year, still on the sideline of the political, militarily in the Middle East, but it's getting there. And I think GCC and Israel, main ally, the US, is very worried about both Israel and I would say especially the UAE relations, and perhaps Saudi Arabia as well, relations with China. In the Gulf is particularly, it's not just technology, but it might be strategic as well. And I read some of the reports going out, especially the Wall Street Journal a few months ago. US is very worried. Some of the countries are hedging their bets out of fear where the US might be going next. Is it leaving the region? And let me remind you that China, especially for the Gulf countries, is the main partners, main economic partners, buying most of their oil for years now. So this is a very, very important question that we might encounter for the next years.
Okay, Ambassador Jamal, anything?
Yes, China is a very strong strategic economic partner with the region, and it shall remain so. Regarding, it's natural for Iran to, given the current circumstances and the pressure it is facing in different aspects, to search for international support, such as finding membership in the SCO, if it is accepted. I think this is a natural thing. Wouldn't have expected it to do anything different. Will things change in terms of our relationships with China? No, it remains a partner, a strong economic, strategic partner.
Thank you very much. We do have one last one before I'll then try and bring it to a close, but it does go back to Iran, and it's now talking about, and the view from the person who's posed the question is that thinking that the JCPOA look increasingly set to collapse. That's still moot, I think, but how can Israel, UAE, Bahrain leverage their relationship to influence the Biden administration to draw up contingency plans to deal with Tehran's malign activities, which presumes that the United States, with all its power, doesn't have already contingency plans to deal with Iran's malign behavior. But if we put that slightly to one side, are the views on the likelihood of the JCPOA? We don't necessarily want to go down that far, but more relevantly, what could Israel, the Emirates, and Bahrain do to underpin or change direction or reinforce with the Biden administration. And since there's a state involved in that question, Ambassador Jamal, if you have a point on that, and if not, that's fine as well.
I think I'll just give our official position. Bahrain conducts political consultation with its regional partners and with our allies and friends in the United States on a matter of mutual interest, including the JCPOA. We support the weapons and a WMD free zone here in the Middle East, and we will remain to do so.
Thank you very much. That was very succinct and nicely put. Yo.
I think the ultimate goal should remain bringing Iran back to the table. I'm in favor, and I was before. I even supported JCPOA, although I think it's problematic, but I think it's better than nothing. I do hope that the Americans have a contingency plan, plan B. I'm not sure, and I do hope that Israelis, Saudis, Emiratis, and Americans all talk together and try to promote such a plan. What this plan might include, I don't know, more pressure, more of the same, economic, diplomatic pressure, perhaps clandestine pressure, trying to push Iran back to the table, make it understand that the pressure will go up. I'm not sure the Americans are on board, but I do hope. Last comment, because the sensitivity in the Gulf, because of the proximity to Iran, because Iran is a stronger and fearful neighbor, threatening neighbor, I don't see a public united front with Israel on the Iranian matter. I don't think they can afford it. I don't think the Gulf states will go that far, especially if you look at the past 2 years and sensitivities, the Emirati sensitivities, even Saudi. Everyone is talking about with Iran now. Everybody's at least maybe appeasing Iran, even because of the question mark where the U.S. is going. They don't really know. I'm not sure how much they support the U.S. This is a big problem. Sitting on the sidelines and watching, like everyone.
That's fine, Hassan.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, if I were a policymaker in an Arab Gulf capital, which I'm not, then I'd be busy trying to come up with a minimal, I think, space of agreement. Not only with, I mean, first of all, amongst the GCC themselves, as far as the JCPOA is concerned, but also with countries that share similar concerns about Iran's foreign policy, including Israel. And so I think, you know, the Gulf states would be would be wasting their time trying to get involved in the nuclear non-proliferation aspect of this. I think the key diplomatic objective is how do the Arab Gulf states ensure that their concerns on Iran's especially short-range and medium-range missiles on the one hand, and on Iran's other regional activity involving armed non-state actors and groups, how do these become sort of bumped up on the policy agenda of the present US administration? And I think here there is the Arab Gulf states agree on a certain number of things, in principle, share a certain number of concerns among themselves and with other countries in the region, including Israel. And I think if I were an Arab Gulf policymaker, which again I'm not, then I would be busy trying to forge at least an agreement or a consensus on what these issues of joint concern are and how they might, and to think creatively as to the best diplomatic means through which progress could be made on them with Iran, of course, through the US administration. But that requires a large degree of diplomatic coordination and coalition building, even if behind diplomatic closed doors on many of these issues.
Hassan, thank you very much. I think we haven't had a chance to answer all the questions. One, that we haven't been able to touch on, and I apologize to Yassim Hussein, is with the recent election results in Morocco, what's happening there. We just don't have time to do it. Reminding everyone, this was about the Abraham Accords, 1 year on, evolving partnerships and persistent challenges. It's no surprise, and we expected and we anticipated and we were ready for it, that the Palestinian issue would be first and foremost. There were a number of questions. Some were very measured and balanced. Others were slightly more antagonistic. But I think all of the panelists looked at that. I thought it was interesting that old security partnerships were helpful with leverage in bringing about the ceasefire. American peace was important too, but also the role of the new quartet, as Yoel calls them, but certainly the Emirates and Bahrain, recognizing Hassan's part that it is difficult to see how that conglomeration can make material difference to Israel's intentions, and it's going to require wider diplomacy for those. We also inevitably touched on Iran, and that was what the most recent part was. At face value, many people would have said that the reason why the Gulf states, certainly two of the Gulf states, were interested in this was because of Iran, and why Israel was interested in it was also because of Iran. And the carrot that America used, the transactional nature, was about certain things for those countries that resonated here. And that also plays back to the four or three ways that Hassan and Yoel described this. And both of them talked in one way or another about people to people, whether that's in the economic realm or whatever. And then with Ambassador Jamal, we had a very clear description, I think, of Bahrain's motivations. And going back to what she said at the beginning was that this has been going, the stance with Israel has been going on for a long time, and it hasn't made much difference. And so new thinking had to be brought in. And then lastly, and I'm going to give the last accolade to Yoel, in that whilst he was pessimistic at the beginning, he then looked at the glass half full towards the end, and did remind us all that, it's 70 plus years that there's been a position of an adversarial position between the Arab countries and Israel. And we've only had 1 year of the Abraham Accords. And as one of the questioners asked, and as Yoel said, it's been during a pandemic. So to expect a seismic shift in behavior, and indeed in terms of people's beliefs and so on in that period, would have been frankly incredible. But certainly Bahrain and certainly the Emirates seem to be putting both their diplomatic and financial efforts where they made those statements a year ago in what they hope will be a pursuit of a better peace in the region. But it's still a long way to go. There's another 69 years, and in 140 years since 1948, we'll see where we've got to. But we're writing the history too early, but it was worthwhile, I think, and I hope all of the attendees who joined will thank the panelists for sharing their perspectives on the Abraham Accords only 1 year on. And thank you very much. And to the panelists, thank you for your contributions today. It's much appreciated.